My name is Quick Mac. I am the current president of the Northwest Arkansas CCIM chapter. During this global pandemic, we want to make sure we are putting relevant content in front of you. And so I'd like to welcome you to our chapter's first online webinar. We're especially excited to have our special guest from the University of Arkansas College of Business, Mervin Jebaraj. He is the director of the Center of Business and Economic Research and will be talking to us today about what the economy will look like in a post-COVID world. So without further ado, Mervin, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Quick. So this is only my fourth or so Zoom presentation. I'm very used to doing this in person in front of 120 or 150 people. And it certainly feels weird to be talking into a screen and not having personal interactions. And I hope we're all able to get back into that world very soon. So today's presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are today before we end up talking about where we think we will be here in Northwest Arkansas and the country as a whole. I do want to say that this has been very different than any recession that we've had, at least since we started keeping statistics on things like recessions. At least, those types of statistics we've only kept since the mid-30s. So the first really depression that we kept statistics for, the Great Depression. And so we didn't really keep detailed statistics in the pandemic of 1918. So we're kind of sort of flying blind through this a little bit. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so. And then if you guys can think of questions that you have, please put them in the chat, or I guess you'll be able to speak after I finish presenting, and we'll be able to take questions. And I look forward to hearing your questions. And I do want to hear a lot more of your questions. And I want to hear from you guys about what you're seeing within your fields as well. Because there's a lot more timely data that you guys get than the kind of public sources of data that we're relying on here. Always talk about, how the national economy is doing. This is just kind of to get you in the mood for where we are today. So we had about 2 full years of 10 full years of economic expansion in 2009 to 2019. We didn't quite make it to 11 full years of economic expansion. I think whenever they start dating the recession, they'll probably start it in the first quarter of 2020. So the recession would have, the economic expansion that we've had so far would have ended at the end of 2020. And so even so, it was the longest economic expansion in US history, by far, at least a year on the next longest economic expansion that we've ever seen. So from that perspective, that's pretty impressive. It has always been a low growth type of economic expansion. So the average economic growth during that period of expansion from 2009 to 2019, end of 2020, averaged about 2.3%. The previous longest economic expansion averaged about 3.5%, so quite a bit slower than previous economic expansions. And that is evident by, these lines that you see here. There are very few times that the economy actually grew above 3%. And during this entire time of this economic expansion, never once in any year did the economy grow by more than 3% on an annual basis. So 2014 and 2018 came close. They both got to 2.9%. No year reached 3%. So at the end of that graph, you see what's happened in the first quarter and a projection for what you see in the second quarter of 2020, and then no projections after that, because I am not an epidemiologist and I don't know how long this disease is going to last. But you see the first quarter growth rate was, a negative 5-something%. That's annualized. And then the second quarter projection is showing 28.5% decline in GDP on an annualized basis. I cut the graph off at 10% because I didn't want to skew the graph there by showing you a negative 28.5%. But it's pretty dramatic, and it's not something that we've seen in the US economy. Now, caution you with these large numbers like 28.5%. Those are annualized. So that means that if the economy grew at the pace that it's growing in the second quarter of 2020, then the entire year's economy would decline by 28.5%. So that's the same thing for the first quarter of 2020. The data that we have so far that showed a 5.8% decline in GDP, or 5.2% decline in GDP. All that said is that if the economy was like the first quarter of 2020 throughout the year, then that would be the decline in GDP for 2020. So the actual decline between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2020 was only about 1.8 or less than 2%. The rest of it is just the impact of annualization. And when we look at sectors in the economy that have struggled the most in the first quarter, and this is true for here as well, about half the decline in GDP came from healthcare of all sectors. So, people think of hospitals making a lot of money from COVID-19 patients. They're not. They actually lose money on COVID-19 patients. And because they have essentially stopped pretty much all other types of care, hospitals are losing a lot of money, and that's where you see about half the decline in GDP coming from is from the healthcare sector. It's not just hospitals, but dentists and optometrists and all sorts of medical care providers that are not providing services. So that's where half the decline came from. About a third of the decline came from the restaurant and hospitality sector. So not a big impact yet in the first quarter, but that's where we're going to see a whole lot of the impact in the second quarter, obviously, because the first quarter, most of the closures of businesses happened at middle to early March. And so it wasn't really showing a whole lot of impact in the first quarter data. So this has been, the other big piece of news that you see nationally and here in the state is the headline unemployment rate. Obviously, there is quite a bit of unemployment here in Northwest Arkansas and in Arkansas as a whole. You look at the U.S. unemployment rate, it's north of 14%. As you can see, I pushed this graph all the way back to the previous recession. It peaked at north of 10%, so we're past that point in terms of unemployment for the national economy. And then you look at where Arkansas was, typically about 2% or so less than the national economy. And we're about 4% less than the national economy right now, but we're past 10% in the unemployment rate here for the state as a whole. So we haven't been, it's not that we haven't been impacted as much. When you look at why we see the unemployment rate discrepancy between between the state and the nation as a whole, I think this chart gives you sort of an idea of where that is. I know it's a little busy to look at on your screens, but I pointed the arrow to where Arkansas is. And so the orange dots are where employment was in February divided by the population of that state. So this is the employment population ratio. It's the number of people employed divided by the population over the age of 16. And so you can see those orange dots. Even before any of this started, we were only third best from the bottom. So there are only 3 other states here, or 3 to 4 other states that really did worse than us: West Virginia, Mississippi. There's 2 of them, New Mexico, again, from the retirement communities there, that did worse than us. So just these 3 states that did worse than us in February. And since then, we've had an employment drop, but there are other states that dropped a whole lot more. So all of these states that had much higher employment to population ratios in February than Arkansas did dropped a whole lot more. And so a lot of those states depend on, the worst performing state here is Nevada, obviously depends a whole lot more on the hospitality industry than Arkansas does. And so you've seen our employment to population ratio actually improve in ranking. So we went from 3rd worst in the nation to about 10th worst in the nation. So that's when you look at our headline unemployment rate not performing as bad as the rest of the nation, it's probably because we didn't have a lot of employment compared to our population to begin with. So there wasn't a whole lot of room to fall to begin with. And that's been a feature in Arkansas throughout this economic expansion, is that our employment to population ratio has stubbornly stayed below 60%. And that's been our labor force participation. We don't have data for all the metropolitan areas for April yet, so the last bit of data that we have is for March. But you can see for a very long time after declining unemployment rates, we finally see tick up here in March for every metro area across Arkansas, including our region here in Northwest Arkansas. Our unemployment rate jumped about 1%. So far in March, it's going to jump a whole lot more than that when we get the April reading in a couple of weeks. And real quickly, just to look at employment levels in Arkansas, and again, you see that huge drop off here. That's between March and April. That's where you see the huge impact in jobs lost. Compared to April of last year, we've lost about 111,000 jobs statewide. That's nearly 9% drop in employment. And that puts us where we were in 2014. The period between 2014 and 2017 were the period of fastest growth in the state of Arkansas. It was also the period of fastest growth here in Northwest Arkansas, and we'll talk about that. But the loss in jobs, the current loss in jobs, puts us in 2014 before that time period, which is here where you see the fast pace of job growth for the state as a whole. The metro areas contributed about 70,000, a little more than 70,000 of the jobs lost, of the 111,000 jobs, and non-metro areas, so the more rural areas in Arkansas, contributed just under 40,000 of those jobs lost. And so if you want to look at which sectors they are, obviously at the bottom you see, this is a stunning graph in the sense that, a while back this was all pointing the other direction, and now it's all negative here. This is April 2019 to April 2020, just to give you perspective of where those jobs were lost. Close to 35% of that loss comes from the leisure and hospitality. So these are your hotels and the restaurants and those types of jobs. That's about 41,000 of the 111,000 jobs came from this particular sector. And you see healthcare right up close to the overall average. That's actually, in terms of sheer numbers, the second largest. That's about 20,000 jobs lost in the healthcare sector. When it says education and health services, almost all those jobs are in healthcare, not in education, because that's private sector education. And then you see job losses across every sector in the economy. And just for perspective, this is where we are today, April 2019 to April 2020. This is where we were on a 10-year time scale between 2009 and 2019. So that period of economic expansion for the country as a whole and here in Arkansas. These are the sectors that did best in Arkansas. And so professional business services on top. Most of that job growth was in Northwest Arkansas. But then statewide, we saw a lot of job growth in leisure and hospitality. So when we've lost these 41,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality this year, that's been the sector that has grown the most. And it pretty much sinks most of that job gain during that economic expansion that we've seen in leisure and hospitality between 2009 and 2019. And so you see some of the other sectors that have contributed to job gains in that economic expansion. Those job losses are not nearly as much as you see here. Obviously, financial activities lost employment as well, but not nearly as much as they'd gained during that time period. Healthcare obviously gained a whole lot of jobs, haven't quite lost all those jobs, but a significant drop in that particular sector for the state. So looking here at Northwest Arkansas, we have data for April. That's about 20,000 jobs lost from April 2019 to April 2020. That's close to an 8% job loss. And for the Northwest Arkansas region, that brings us to a 2016 level of employment. So again, Northwest Arkansas, the period of fastest economic growth was between 2014 and 2017. So we've gotten to about 2016 level of employment. This number is probably going to continue to drop the employment. So we will probably eventually find ourselves to about the 2014 level of employment in Northwest Arkansas as well. And much like the rest of the state, again, you see drops across almost every sector. In Northwest Arkansas, small positives in the financial services, these are banks and real estate, professional business services. This tends to be the largest category of employment growth in Northwest Arkansas. Generally, saw a very, very modest, about 1.2% increase in employment there. Construction was flat. and then just about every other sector was negative. Again, leisure and hospitality were leading losses, followed by healthcare. So leisure and hospitality here in Northwest Arkansas lost about 11,000 jobs. So about 10% of the entire job loss in the state was in the leisure and hospitality industry here in Northwest Arkansas, because we've seen tremendous growth again in that particular sector here, because we've invested quite a bit in the leisure and hospitality industry in Northwest Arkansas. And then healthcare lost about 5,000 jobs here in Northwest Arkansas. So again, quite a significant decrease in that particular sector. And again, for perspective, this is what our 10-year picture was during the economic expansion. Professional business services leading the way there. So we haven't seen a whole lot of job losses in that particular sector, but we are seeing job losses in every sector that's not professional business services in Northwest Arkansas right now. I have some delays here in my screen. Let me see if I can catch back up. There we go. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in real estate here in Northwest Arkansas. Obviously, residential real estate, we have a little more timely data because we're able to download sales as they go along at the end of each month. We'll have new data at the end of this month as well. But if you're looking at this, you see that the dark green bars are 2018, the lighter green bars are 2019, and the red bars are 2020. It's hard to say that we're really struggling in terms of number of homes sold here. Obviously, there is some variation between March and April. But if you just look back to a couple of years ago, we're obviously outperforming those years in the month of April than we were last year. So right now, it's still the number of homes sold is on an upward trajectory compared to 2018 and 2019, just in overall sales. That's not particularly surprising because, again, when we look at what sectors we lost jobs in, at the very bottom, you see leisure and hospitality. Those are typically not the types of jobs that support home ownership. So those are never people that were in the home buying market per se. But the healthcare jobs are definitely jobs that support home ownership. And so that piece will affect us. Hospitals have furloughed quite a bit of their employees, but a lot of them are bringing them back over the next few months. That, of course, assumes that our case rates don't jump, which they are right now. So, but as long as we're able to get those jobs back in healthcare and stuff, we should continue to, maintain this sort of pace of home sales that we're seeing in Northwest Arkansas, especially given the low mortgage rates. And so when we look at the price of homes sold, we're not seeing any drop off there. So it's not showing any indications of lesser demand for homes sold. With the mortgage rates as low as they are today, home prices are still maintaining their high levels. That's the median home price in Northwest Arkansas in April was $226, quite close to $227,000. And you can see that it increased every single month this year and is at a much higher level than it was in 2019 or 2018. We don't have up-to-date commercial data in terms of vacancy rates at commercial office spaces, but we have been talking to a lot of our respondents across Northwest Arkansas to try to figure out what's going on in those markets. This just gives you a picture of where we were at the end of the second half of 2019. So you'll see that generally we're looking at a very stable commercial real estate market in Northwest Arkansas at the end of 2019. The office sector had seen quite a bit of addition of space in 2019. In 2018, and almost all of that space was getting absorbed. We saw a lot of people moving from Class B office space to Class A office space because they wanted to move to sort of nicer office space. Now, there's still quite a bit of office construction going on. I think people's assumption is that at some point, I think people will be sick of working from home, and employers will want, and employees will want to be able to work from offices and work around other people. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily going to happen very soon. I think when it does happen, it'll happen in phases. But I think a lot of other people have sort of, some people at least have proclaimed that, oh, well, office spaces are not going to do so well in the future. And I just don't think that this has that type of long-lasting impact. I think it has an impact for as long as we don't have a vaccine. And I think our memories tend to be fairly short after that, that once we feel safe to work in sort of office spaces and be in crowds, I think there's going to be quite a bit of pent-up demand for that sort of thing, and it's going to come back fairly soon. The piece that had shown some stability here in Northwest Arkansas is that blue line that you see in retail. Obviously, you saw the retail vacancy rate climb through several years. You saw a lot of closures of sort of big box stores, and then you saw sort of this decline in the retail vacancy rate over time, because again, a lot of that got reclassified as some kind of office space. So I would fully expect that the retail vacancy rate is going to climb again. Not only because we're again seeing closures of big box stores. We saw Pier 1 was going to permanently close, and there are going to be several kinds of retail establishments that were always teetering on the edge, that were always going to close at the next recession, and this is that recession. So we're going to see more vacancy rates in retail. Obviously, we're going to see restaurants and those types of businesses go out of business as well, and we'll talk a little bit about what trends we're seeing in that particular sector. The one jump up that you see here is in warehouse that happened here, and then it's stayed relatively stable at the second half of 2019 and the first half of 2019. And I think we'll probably see some improvement in the warehouse space just because people have been, shipping a lot of stuff home during this time, and so we will see a lot more demand for warehouse space that allows quicker shipping to people's homes. So to get at the idea of how we can kind of get to data that's a lot faster and more responsive to trying to figure out what's going on in the commercial real estate market, this shows you sort of on a weekly basis, if you will, consumer spending, overall consumer spending in Northwest Arkansas. I have here Benton and Washington counties. And so this shows you the sort of percentage change. The gray line at the top is Arkansas as a whole, blue line's Benton County, red line's Washington County. And you'll see that consumer spending in Arkansas as a whole has, gotten back to January levels. So all of this is comparing to sort of the average consumer spending level that we saw in early January. Now, obviously, what we do know about retail spending is that spending in January is lower because a lot more people have gone out and spent all their money that they would have spent typically over the Christmas time period. And January is the time when people return gifts and do all this. It's not a time for great retail spending in general. So when we're comparing where we are today in May to January, that gives you an idea. This January is not a month of high spending, and in the state as a whole, we're only about 4% or so, at least in this week, higher than where we were in January. In Benton and Washington County, we're much lower than where we were in January, which means that we're much lower than where we should be at this given time in May. So if we were to be able to compare this, and we don't have the data yet, to be able to compare sort of weekly spending from May of this year to May of last year, but it is much higher in May than it is in January. So where you see 15% drop in spending in Benton County compared to January this year, and 21% drop in Washington County, that is hitting Northwest Arkansas, at least in overall consumer spending, a lot harder than it is other parts of the state. So when you look at time spent outside the home, which is the chart below there, and it shows you the percentage change in the time spent outside the home, this is when the shutdowns were really announced, is this line here. And you'll see that people were already being a lot more careful before the shutdowns were even announced. So in the sense that people had already stopped congregating in public places and being outside the home a whole lot before official shutdown measures were instituted. And so when you look at compared to time spent outside the home in January, Arkansas as a whole is still about 10% less than there. Benton County is about 16.8% less than there, and Washington County is about 13.4% less than where we were in January. And obviously, again, January is a lot colder than May is, so people tend to be out of the home a lot more in May than they would have been in January. So again, when we're comparing sort of a warmer spring month, we're comparing it to a cold winter month, and we're not quite to how much people were moving around in January in the month of May. That tells you how much people, how much precautions people are taking to avoid being infected with this disease. So when we look at other places across the state, you'll actually see that only Craighead County, where Jonesboro is, and Northwest Arkansas, kind of places where people are generally taking precautions and staying home. A lot of other parts of the state, you see people are still traveling much closer to where they were in January. Again, that doesn't mean that they're doing better, because January's travel is obviously going to be lower than where it should be in May. But a lot of other places are seeing people moving a whole lot more than here in Northwest Arkansas and in Jonesboro for comparison purposes. So this sort of gives you screen stuck. Let's see if I can, there we go. So this sort of gives you an idea of where you're seeing movement. Obviously, the first side, the left-hand side, is retail and recreation. So those are essentially considered non-essential businesses, right? So those are restaurants, those are retail that are not grocery stores. And then on the right-hand side, you see grocery and pharmacy considered essential businesses. So again, compared to the baseline is the month of January, which we again know is not a month of great retail expenditures. You see that grocery and pharmacy expenditures are much higher than they were in January. Obviously, because people are staying home and starting to eat at home a lot more, so grocery expenditures have gone up. We obviously see a lot more increase early on, and that's kind of tapered off. So people have stopped panic buying toilet paper and other things at grocery stores. But where we're not seeing in Benton and Washington County sort of return to normal is in the non-essential retail and recreation. So when we compare ourselves to the rest of the state, you see that their consumer spending has generally gone back to about January levels. Northwest Arkansas is still an order of magnitude less than that. It's because people in Benton and Washington County are quite, they've improved quite a bit from where they were. See these declines in how much they were going to non-essential retail. Those have improved quite a bit compared to the baseline, but they're still a whole lot lower than where they were in January, which means they're a whole lot lower than where they were in typically would be in March and April and May as the weather warms up. And so this, again, is a chart that shows you small businesses. So the previous chart that I was showing you for consumer spending, this data comes from credit card and debit card processing data. And retail, especially bigger box retail, is overrepresented in this data. So a lot of the spending increase that you see in Arkansas and where we're getting closer to baseline is happening at bigger box stores. Food places in particular are underrepresented in this particular measure of consumer spending. This measure of small businesses is overrepresented in the food businesses, and big box retail is underrepresented in this. So they're coming from two different data sets that they're getting weekly data from. And so this is measuring it based on business transaction data as opposed to consumer data from credit and debit card processing. So in this particular case, it gets you a better idea of how smaller businesses are doing, especially restaurants and places that sell food and beverages across the state. And so when you look at this, you see that even though the state had seen a consumer expenditure increase, they're not seeing a whole lot of activity happening of that at the smaller businesses, especially food businesses. So again, the state as a whole, you see the number of small businesses, especially food businesses, a greater number of them are open than where they were in early April. But Benton and Washington County, again, are much lower than that and pretty close to actually where, and I think this is true anecdotally as you go around our area here, a lot of people that shut down their in-person dining services are continuing to keep their in-person dining services closed and just maintain curbside delivery and those types of services, at least in early May. And I think people are waiting to June and just wait and see how that proceeds before they open up in-person dining services. Although with case rates going up, that I think will cause quite a bit of pause. And so this chart shows you revenue change at small businesses. Again, you see this huge decline here. You've seen some improvement in both Bennett and Washington County as businesses sort of figure out the curbside delivery mechanisms and all those things. You're seeing some increase in revenue, but again, not anywhere close to where they were in January, which again, January is not a particularly great month for retail at small or large businesses. And then this shows you the number of hourly employees. This is got from payroll processing data that small businesses use, and it shows you the change in hourly employees at small businesses. So again, in spite of the PPP loans that have been made available and all of the other support and some partial reopenings, you're really not seeing an increase in employment, which indicates again that they're not quite ready to come back to normal, because again, small businesses are not sure that their customers are going to be there. And so when you look at time spent outside the home in Benton and Washington County, it's not back to January levels. So I think businesses, smaller businesses, are probably right in maintaining their doors shut over this time period, because again, even if they open, I doubt they're going to see customers flocking back to them. And this gives you, so I want to talk quickly, at least for about a minute or two, about what we're seeing in national trends of where we think things will be. So the percent of people avoiding crowded places has sort of declined. So people are willing to go out more. So the gray dots are April, the blue dots are May. Nationally, you see about a 5% increase in people willing to go to crowded places. But we can't quite operate an economy at 70% or only 30% capacity, so we'll need to see a whole lot more improvement. So this obviously does not survey Arkansas, but states around us, Missouri, for example. So here, this did not survey the week after the Lake of the Ozarks thing that you saw, obviously, but this was taken the week before that. So clearly a lot more people in Missouri are willing to travel in the week after. And Texas is represented here as well, and so you see fewer people in Texas than in Missouri willing to travel. But how do we get more people comfortable with going out in public? I think that's going to take people maintaining social distance. We're seeing greater adoption level of that nationally. Obviously, we want to push this number above 90% to make everybody comfortable with the idea that people are maintaining physical distance from other people so they feel safer going out in crowded places. And we need a lot more people wearing masks. So nationally, it's about 84%. I would venture to guess from my adventures outside observing people is that that number is lower than 80-something% here in Arkansas in terms of the number of people willing to wear masks. You can see Missouri is about 77%. Texas, on the other hand, is about 90%, so much greater mask adoption. So I think when you see behaviors of a lot more people willing to maintain the physical distance of 6 feet or more, and a lot more people willing to wear masks in public, I think you'll see a lot more people in Northwest Arkansas, especially willing to travel outside their homes, and that will give small businesses the ability to open their doors to customers. Again, this is sort of the longer term. What we need to be able to get more people out in public is obviously we need to be able to test a lot more people. We don't quite have that testing capacity quite yet here in the state, but we also need people willing to be able to take the test, willing to be able to take the vaccine, especially when one is available. And right now, people are a lot more skeptical about those things, and we need that change. I'll stop my presentation there and take questions from you guys.
If you guys have a question, just, I don't know, put it down in the chat or let me know so I can get you.
And I'd really like to hear from all of you too about what you're seeing within your businesses, especially in the commercial real estate sector, how that's going.
Ryan asked, do you think we will see a quick recovery, at least in part, when business bring employees back from furlough?
I think it depends on the type of business. I think hospitals in particular, yes, I think there's quite a bit of pent-up demand for healthcare healthcare services. People have skipped eye appointments, dental appointments, and just generally every other kind of healthcare procedure that is needed was not an emergency procedure. So I think there is quite a bit of pent-up demand for there. But for hospitals to return to normal, we'll need much lower case counts that we're currently seeing here in Northwest Arkansas. So hospitals had planned to bring their employees back in June and in July, but I think that's very much dependent on how the case counts are, and it's not looking good at this particular moment. Other businesses that have furloughed their employees, restaurants, I think, can bring some more employees if they're able to operate at greater capacities, but that entirely depends on how their customers are willing to sort of follow the guidelines without raising a stink about maintaining distance and wearing masks. And sort of a lot of businesses are not opening back up because they don't want to have to deal with the hostilities that come with requiring people to wear this. But unless we get enough people to wear the mask to where the disease doesn't spread quite easily and maintain physical distance, you're going to have a significant portion of the population not willing to go out and be in public, which makes it harder for businesses to recall their furloughed employees. Now, I think that for as long as business, especially restaurants, are going to have to operate at 50, 33%, 70%, but probably not quite close to 100% anytime soon, it doesn't make sense for them to bring all their employees back. And I think it actually makes better financial sense for them to stay on unemployment for those employees and then just bring back the ones that they can use for whatever level of business they have. The other question I see there is about future of office space use. Yes, I am fairly optimistic. I just think, I think there's usually an immediate reaction to crowded spaces because of this. I think that once we're past it, people's tolerance for staying at home and working from home and not being around other people diminishes over time. And I think some people thrive in non-office spaces and non-crowded spaces. But a lot of other people want the physical interaction and want to be around other people. So I think once we're past this and once it's safe, there's a reason why office spaces have done well for so many years. There's a reason why employers have invested a whole lot in office spaces, is because people want to be able to work in a nice space around them. And I think over time, you're going to continue to see, once we're able to go past this pandemic, I think during the pandemic, I think employers are going to continue to encourage their employees to stay at home if they can and sort of only work in phases at the offices to maintain physical distance. But once we're past that, I think there's going to be quite a bit of impetus from employers particularly, and from a significant proportion of employees that will want to be in an office and not be at home with sort of children running around and all sorts of other distractions to work as well. I think I see a question about the top 3 drivers for recovery. So, what we have heard anecdotally here in Northwest Arkansas is that people within the logistics and transportation space and professional business services, sort of the types of businesses that service the big 3 employers here in Northwest Arkansas, are continuing to look at Northwest Arkansas as a place for growth and expansion. And I think some of this is sort of short-term considerations. Obviously, the case counts where a lot of these companies might be headquartered is much higher in bigger, more denser cities. And they look at Northwest Arkansas and they say, well, this is not a dense city. Maybe we could move a lot more of our office operations there and maybe it'll be safer over time. I think in the short run, we might see a little bit more movement in that direction, but I don't know that it necessarily persists. I think cities have large advantages in terms of economies of scale. Cities have always been engines of economic development. Northwest Arkansas is trying to grow its population, become more denser, like some of the bigger metro areas. So attracting a lot more people here makes us denser as well. So I think that in the short run, you will see a little bit more growth in the transportation logistics space and professional business services that make up for some of the furlough losses in healthcare. But once we're out of this recession, again, when we came out of the last recession, the sectors that grew the most were professional business services, Those tend to be higher paying jobs. They're lawyers, accountants, engineers, marketing consultants, all kinds of those types of jobs. And so we will continue to see that type of growth once we're out of this recession as well.
I see a question.
What? Yes. You know, I think as far as the education system in Northwest Arkansas, again, most of that education is in public school education. So we're not particularly worried from an employee headcount at public schools, as long as the state is willing to continue to pay teachers and so on and so forth. I think we'll be fine from an employment perspective. But public school districts have actually furloughed a lot of their support staff. It's been bus drivers and people that work in cafeterias and janitorial teams and all of those things. So we've seen a lot of those types of employees lose employment. Obviously, a lot of them are collecting unemployment benefits at this given point, so that's probably made up for quite a bit of their wages lost if they're able to get through the system and get their unemployment benefits. But you know, those sort of beefed up unemployment benefits kind of end pretty soon. So it's entirely dependent on Congress to sort of extend the unemployment benefits longer for a longer period of time. So I don't know that the educational system, especially the K through 12 system, doesn't spur a whole lot of other types of business activity. What does matter is the university system, and in particular the University of Arkansas here. I think it would be a significant impact on the leisure and hospitality sector here in Northwest Arkansas if students don't return to campus in the fall. And in particular, it would affect the apartment complexes that have been built around the university that cater to students, typically the kind of ones that rent by the bed. Now, I think if students are, you know, I think currently the university is looking at something like if you're class sort of on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you would go to class on Monday, and then a third of the class would attend in person on Monday. The rest of the class would attend online. And on Wednesday, a different third would attend in person. And on Friday, a different third would attend in person. So to try to give everybody a 1 day a week in class experience for that particular class so that we can maintain physical distance between students, etc. But all of these plans were contingent on case rates not going up, especially in our community here in Northwest Arkansas, and that's not been true over the last several days. So I'm sure that's caused reason to pause that type of thinking. Again, if you bring all these students back to campus, it's a lot harder to get them to maintain physical distance. And, you know, if we do have a case on campus, it'll necessitate almost immediately a lot of shutdowns on campus. And what the university doesn't really want to do is have students move here and then send them back home. So I think they wanted to do in-person classes at some point in the fall, and I think they have a little bit more time to decide that. And I still think that is the ideal plan, but that does depend on case counts in Northwest Arkansas going down. And if we don't have in-person students, then I think those residential apartment complexes, they're not seeing currently, at least from our survey data, we're not seeing a whole lot of lease ups. They're much lower than where they would be. Typically, students that graduate in May, or sort of not graduate in May, but leave school for the summer and come back in the fall, they sign leases for the fall before they leave. And not as many students have done that this time because they're not sure whether they'll be in person here in Northwest Arkansas in the fall. So the lease rates are much lower than where they would be for the fall right now. But I think, again, if the university announces that students are welcome back on campus in the fall, you'll see those lease rates go back up pretty close to where they would be. Because if you think about where you were when you were in college, you don't want to stay at home with your parents, and you'd rather be off by yourself in college in your apartment complex. So the other big piece is obviously football. At this point, I'm unable to see how we could have fans in the stands, even at the low levels of attendance we had last year when the team was doing terribly. So I think, you know, people want to see football, but we might end up watching a whole lot of it on TV. I just it seems impossible at this given moment that we could have that many people in stands, and it's not. And you look at other countries and how disease is spread from having people attend large gatherings like this. It's just not a good idea right now. So I think that particular side of the leisure and hospitality industry will continue to suffer here in Northwest Arkansas. And actually, they took a hit last year as well, just because the team was so bad and so few people came to Northwest Arkansas to watch the games.
Tom Allen asked, I'm interested in your comments on people returning to offices for work. That was welcome opinion. Do you see any changes to the office environment relative to how they are structured today?
Yeah, I think so. I talked about this, I think, at the beginning of the year and the end of some point last year when we were talking about office space. So there's been sort of this move over time to build open office plans. That's been the in vogue trend around the country. And sort of, it's always been this way that commercial office space trends are about 10 years behind where the research was. So it used to be that people did a bunch of research in office spaces and they decided, oh, well, if you have open office space, it encourages a lot of collaboration and that kind of thing. And so people took down the cubicle walls and put up, open desks for people to sit across from each other and just talk and whatever. And then as enough people did that, we had, office spaces to study. And over time, people figured out that, oh, well, what happens is if you take down the cubicle walls and don't give people offices, they actually interact with each other a whole lot less counterintuitively, because they actually prefer privacy even when they're interacting with each other. They like to not be talking to another person in front of an entire audience. Sort of when they surveyed people about this, people felt that when they were conversing with other colleagues, they felt like they were on a stage in front of other people just because they were sort of standing in the middle of the office and talking to everybody. So the research has now moved the other direction. So the research is already ahead of the pandemic in terms of recommending, walls, cubicles, and separation between employees so that they feel more private. And I think that will change as a response to the pandemic. So that's not to say that we don't need office space, that we will change the type of office space. So I think people will start wanting separation and barriers between people. So in terms of physical square foot, that actually increases the demand for the square footage of office space, just because people will want more separation between people. And I think, the research is already showing that open plans were not particularly conducive to collaboration. People actually sent more emails than talked to other people. People are using chat as opposed to talking to other people, and just overall collaboration between teams dropped off in an open office space. So that's going to, if the research didn't do it, the pandemic's definitely going to create more demand for sort of physical barriers between people.
Butch wanted to know were the $1,200 checks worth the cost to the country?
Of the $2.3 trillion that the federal government spent in that one single bill, I think the $1,200 was probably the smallest portion. I think it was maybe just north of how much the hospitals got. It's north of how much the hospitals and the state and local governments got, but below what the businesses and other sectors of the economy got. Yeah. So $1,200, I think the federal government could hand out that kind of money. Give it now. People are worried about the debt. I am not worried about the debt at this point because the government is borrowing for free, essentially. The 10-year treasuries are still below 1% in terms of yields. So once you adjust for inflation, that essentially means that people are willing to give the government money on a 10-year time period and lose money over that 10 years. So if there's any time when the government can afford to just hand out money, it's now. I think the worst thing we could do is to sort of turn off the spigot and cause even greater economic harm. The one thing I haven't talked about really is that the PPP has helped a lot of businesses. It's obviously set up in quite a bit of a hurry, and there were a lot of issues that I think when Congress is looking at it again, especially for restaurants, because customers are not willing to go back out and because we're not able to have restaurants operating at 100% capacity, it doesn't make sense to require them to have 70% or 75% of the loan value go to payroll because they can't hire that many people back, because again, then you're going to have too many employees in the place not being able to stand apart from each other. So they're going to have to relax those requirements so that restaurants can use the money to pay rent, pay utilities, and those types of expenses, and not have to call back all their employees while they're not operating at full capacity. So again, when Congress passed the law, that requirement for 75% to be spent on payroll was not in it. That's something that the SBA added on. It's something that Congress could very easily require a lot of exceptions for. And I think that is something that they should look at. So in terms of, the ability of the government to spend money to keep the economy and to keep a lot of businesses operating, they should continue to do that, just because it's very cheap for the government to borrow right now. And I'd much rather they borrowed and maintained the economy than worry about the debt prematurely. As an aside, I would say that we've never actually paid our debt. The only way we ever pay our debt is by growing our economy, so that the debt becomes a smaller percentage of the economy. So if we don't grow the economy, then the debt is really going to come back to bite us. So it's better to borrow now and maintain the economy.
Ray asked, are there factors of concerns, capital investment, that may adversely impact productivity growth after we return to a new normal?
I haven't seen, again, it's too early to see productivity statistics. Productivity in this country has always been pretty bad, especially during this entire economic expansion. If you divide the GDP by the number of people working, productivity levels has been fairly low. That might be a measurement issue. I certainly think productivity has dropped off as more people are working from home, just because there are far more distractions available to more people. But I don't know that it particularly changes productivity long run once we're past the pandemic. I think during the pandemic, obviously, we're going to go through a period of lower productivity, although because the number of people employed has gone down, when you measure GDP level divided by fewer people now, it'll show a boost in productivity. It's just an artifact of the statistic, not actual increase in productivity. So I think in terms of people's productivity, part of the impetus for employers and employees to want to go back to offices is because they tend to be more productive in a more structured environment than they are sort of in an unstructured environment at home. In terms of the productive capacity of capital, it really does depend on what type of business you're looking at. I think for a lot of different sectors, the next year to year and a half is going to look pretty shaky, at least in terms of, especially if they're depending on consumers to provide economic growth. I don't know that we're quite going to get out of this recession very quickly. I don't expect a V-shaped recession. The best we can hope for is a U-shaped recession with a fairly short bottom. But at this point, it seems unlikely that we would get out of this recession before the end of the year.
Robert was wondering, so he's hearing in the service industry that they're having problems finding employees as they reopen. He wonders if that has to do with the lesser student population. I'm wondering if that has to do with they're making more unemployment in Arkansas than they would work.
Yeah, I think they've tried. I think in part, yes, the student population here, over time, summer school used to be a thing that few students took, and now it's a lot more students taking summer school. I think that's A, because maybe their course load during the semester is not as high. B, I think it's just they don't want to go home and be there for 3 months, so they're willing to stay here and be in school, take a class over time. So a lot more people work in the summer while they stay here, and I think it does affect how many people are available to work in the service sector. And I think there's been quite a bit of talk about the $600 additional payment for unemployment and whether that affects. We haven't, obviously we've heard a lot of anecdotes about this from business owners trying to employ people back. But statistically, we haven't seen any significant increase in job postings that are going unanswered. So yes, this is happening to some extent at some businesses, but it's not statistically significant when you measure it against the entire economy. So just because job postings is simply not there at this point. There are, obviously the $600 is having a distortionary effect in some places. The reason they set it up that way is because the state runs, every state around the country runs the unemployment benefits system on, if you guys think back to your computer classes when you were in school and you had sort of this blue screen that you were typing commands in DOS, that's the system that the state runs unemployment benefits off of, and the state was not going to be able to program unemployment benefits to be 100% of wages instead of 45% of wages on the fly while they were processing 111,000 people, applicants all at once. So the federal government figured we'd just give everybody $600, and that $600 really goes close to 100% in high wage states. So in coastal states, that gets them closer to 90, 95% of their wages. Obviously in Arkansas, it gets you to 120 to 130% of your wages. But that was a distortion that they just had to put in there to get something out the door fast. And I think given that they have more time, they will be able to design something different. But the state is still not able. So even if Congress went back and said, all right, just give everybody 100% of their wages, the state system can't be reprogrammed to do that on the fly. And, just looking at the pandemic uninsurance system that the state had to start up from new, and the issues, the numerous issues that they've had with that, it's just not something that the state is going to be able to. So I don't know that we're going to get rid of the $600 additional boost, because no state is going to be able to. You could get rid of it if you had the ability to program 100% of previous wages, but I don't think states are at that point yet.
And I think, last question, like hair salons, spas, those that have opened back up that were self-employed, how is that do you think is going to affect the unemployment number? Because they were in the unemployment number for most of April, and now they're not.
Right, and I think, so hair salons and spas that are open, again, these were independent contractors, that does improve the unemployment number, but again, they're not quite working at the same levels that they were, just because they're seeing fewer numbers of customers, because they have to maintain distance at the store, so they're seeing fewer people come into their stores at any given point. Does that improve the unemployment rate? Yes, but there really aren't that many of them. When you look at the overall employment picture, there's just not that many people that are working in hair salons and massage parlors and this type of activity for there to be a significant increase in employment just from all of them being employed. Now, they're going to be partially employed, but they would count as being employed for the purposes of the headline unemployment statistic. But again, it's not going to greatly improve until you see that leisure and hospitality jobs really come back significantly, which, where we lost a whole lot of jobs in our state. About 40,000 of those jobs came from leisure and hospitality. Those are not hair salon employees and, massage parlors. Those are restaurants, hotels.
Cool. Well, Mervin, listen, we appreciate it. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Mervin for taking the time out to present to us. Really appreciate your insight, and glad you made yourself a resource for us. Nice cat, by the way.
Yeah, it's a productivity loss right here. See, it's going to sit on my keyboard here in a second.
Yeah. I also want to recognize our 2020 platinum sponsors, City Title, C.R. Crawford Construction, Great Southern Bank, and Kutek Rock for continuing to sponsor the chapter. I think this was an excellent topic. I look forward to many more. Mervin, you were great. We really appreciate you again putting this on for us, and look forward to many more in the coming months.
Not a problem. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks.